So I'm going to call the meeting to order. Unlike meeting in the Newcastle Fire Station public meeting room, we don't have a gavel and a bunch of tables to bang on and all, but we are still, for the time being, meeting remotely, and likely after the lobster bake, which is going to be an in-person event, we will probably be changing that. Subject of discussion on the executive committee as we follow how everything is going. So we have an item of business which we'll be taking up later, which is whether to approve some proposed amendments to our bylaws. And before that, we have the great pleasure to be joined by Quinn Gormley as we celebrate Pride Month, the Executive Director of MaineTransNet, which is the largest state-level transgender peer support organization in the country. Quinn will be discussing the status of legislation in Maine and across the country that seeks to restrict civil rights of transgender youth and adults, and talk about ways that allies can support their trans family, friends, and neighbors. So please, everyone, welcome Quinn Gormley.
I can see the applause, but not hear it. That's an interesting feeling. Get my presentation going here. Right. Can you all see a slideshow now?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. It is nice to be back with LCDC tonight as a former King County resident. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. As Chris mentioned, I'm the executive director of an organization called MaineTransNet, or the Maine Transgender Network. We are, in addition to being, one of the largest trans organizations working at the state level in the country, we're also Maine's only organization specifically dedicated to serving the needs of transgender people and those who love us here in Maine. We participate. We work towards that mission through a variety of means, including policy advocacy work, as well as providing a variety of direct and peer-based support services to transgender Mainers. All over the state, we offer support groups from, when not in pandemic times, from Kittery all the way up to Presque Isle and Farmington over to Machias, and we're really focused on making sure that no matter which community a trans person lives in this state, that they have the ability to feel like they belong and that they can live lives free from violence. So before I jump into talking about legislative updates, I thought it might be helpful to take maybe all of 5 minutes just to review some terminology, which I think is helpful in understanding sort of what we're talking about when we talk about the trans community. Because I think if you're not terribly familiar with trans people or the issues that we're facing, it can sometimes feel a bit like you're drowning in alphabet soup anytime you try and listen into a story on NPR or something about our community. So I thought a couple minutes of just a review of terminology would be helpful. So when we talk about the LGBTQ community, we sometimes use a model like this one called the gender person that is helpful in understanding how there's sort of different parts of our identity that can fall under the LGBTQ umbrella. But although multiple people we all have identities that fall under each of these parts of our identity, they are somewhat separate from one another. And so, we might talk about gender identity. We might talk about that as being up there in the head. And this is really, what is someone's personal sense of who they are and what their gender is, as male or female or otherwise. And, that's a personal sense of self. There are certainly a lot of useful ways that we can talk about gender. If we were in like a college classroom talking about gender, we might, talk about it as being like a power dynamic in our society. We might talk about it as being a differential in experiences or a cultural institution. And all of those ways of talking about gender can be useful in certain contexts. But when we're talking about the trans community and gender, what we're really talking about is a personal identity. So yeah, again, when a trans person is talking about their gender, they're generally not trying to generalize the experience of gender to all people, but just trying to talk about our own personal lived experiences. We might talk about gender expression, which is along the side here. And that's really how people are communicating themselves to the rest of the world. And so this might be the clothes that they wear, this might be mannerisms that they have, this might be social cues that they're giving off, but really it's sort of that outward appearance of gender. And when we talk about trans people and interacting with trans people, I think the difference between gender expression and identity can cause a great deal of confusion sometimes, because when you hear that someone is transgender, there is people make a lot of assumptions about what that's supposed to look like. I think about, I was an apprentice at the Carpenter's Wood Shop down in Bristol almost a decade ago, and I was transitioning while I was there. And, I would wake up half an hour before all the other apprentices, and I would take a shower, I'd do my hair, I'd do my makeup, I'd put on a dress, and then I'd walk on down to the workshop there, and I'd put on this big pair of Carhartt overalls over everything. Because I found that if I didn't have this sort of hyper feminine gender expression, that people didn't take my womanhood seriously. And yet that clothing was not remotely practical for working with power tools and wood all day, so I'd have to put something over that. And that's a fairly common experience for trans people, is that if we don't sort of perform our gender the way that others expect us to, that it's not taken seriously. We might talk about attraction, and this is really, who are you drawn towards? So we might talk about attraction in terms of like sexual orientation, so who you physically or sexually attracted to, or we might talk about it in terms of an emotional or romantic orientation. Who do you want to be in relationship with? And oftentimes those two things go hand in hand, but not 100% of the time. You might have someone who says bisexual, they're attracted to their own gender and others, but maybe they're really only interested in having relationships with women. So their romantic orientation would be different. And then lastly, and I think really relevant to our conversation tonight, is sex. And if you've been paying attention at all to the debate going on around these anti-trans bills in the legislature this year, you have probably heard a lot of rhetoric about biological sex. And I think there is a confusion that has been stoked by our opponents that sort of the trans community is trying to argue that sex doesn't exist. And that's not the case. What I think is the case is we're just trying to say that sex is more complicated than how we were taught it in 5th grade 20 years ago, or more. And that sex is not the same thing as gender, and it doesn't have to determine that necessarily. And so when we talk about sex, we talk about sex as being a set of observable characteristics. And, there's a lot of different ways that we can observe those characteristics. If we were to look at a trans person's body, depending on that person's, say, surgical history, we might find that their anatomical sex, our pieces and parts, is one thing. Depending on whether or not they're taking hormones, a blood test might tell us that their sex is another thing based on sort of the balance of estrogens and androgens in their bloodstream. And if we were to look at their chromosomes, we might find yet another answer. And so it's not that sex doesn't exist, it's just that sex is different from gender and a lot more complicated than how we're used to talking about it. Does that make sense to folks? Cool. Again, just as a reminder, when we talk about trans people, of course, having a shared definition of the word transgender is helpful. Before we even talk about a definition, I do like to just emphasize transgender is an adjective. So you can be a transgender person, a transgender man, transgender woman. It's not a verb. You do not go a transgendering down the road. It's not a noun. You cannot be a transgender. And for you English nerds here, it's not a past participle. You cannot be transgendered. We can put the ED on it. And so a trans person, it's just someone whose gender identity doesn't match their sex assigned at birth. And what does that mean in practical terms? It just means that the way that they talk about themselves and their gender probably doesn't match what the doctor checked off on a birth certificate when they were born. And so that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about how they do identify, what to call them. It doesn't tell us anything about their medical past, present, or future. And it certainly doesn't tell us anything about their body. It just says they don't fit into the box because they were put in first. Does that make sense? Cool. We might talk about the term cisgender, which I'm hoping folks have probably come across this at this point. If you're unfamiliar with it, cisgender is to transgender as straight is to gay. It's just what we call people who aren't trans. We call them cisgender. So it's someone, who your identity fits in that first box that you were put into. I do like to just point out cisgender is like a great $5 allyship word. If you can drop it into a conversation with a trans person somewhere, it's kind of this great code of saying, hey, I've paid attention for 10 minutes at some point. I might be a safe person to talk to. So it can be quite useful. And then, of course, we can talk about non-binary people who are certainly in the news a lot more lately, as we've had a number of significant policy victories specific to their lives in the last couple of years. Non-binary, sort of an umbrella term. It covers a whole lot of more specific identities, which really aren't your job to know. But it describes people who don't fit into either of those boxes of male or female all the time. So it might be someone who, they think of themselves as somewhere between male and female. Maybe they're a combination of male and female. Maybe their gender shifts over time. We might talk about them as being gender fluid. Or maybe they just, they don't really consider themselves as having a gender in a personal sense. And so non-binary people, they make up at least a third of our community. We think that's growing. At all ages. I think there's a little bit of a stereotype that non-binary people are, some kind of teenage fad. And I think there are a lot of non-binary youth. Certainly there's a lot of non-binary elder people too. It's not some newly made up term. I think for folks who are new to our community, understanding non-binary people's lives can take a little bit more imagination because it's frequently pretty new information. And I just want to say, it's really not your job to get it. You do not have to understand, at any kind of deep level what it means to be non-binary. All you have to do is respect that the person who's telling you that they're this does get it, and that they probably know better than anyone else who they are. Thumbs up? Is that good? Groovy. All right, that's enough terminology review. Let's talk about some legislation. So, we in Maine here have been fighting back against 3 anti-trans bills. And I think it's very important to note, even before we talk about the content of those bills, is that these bills did not come from nowhere. These bills are part of a nationwide effort to curtail the rights of transgender, mostly women and girls, to fully participate in society. And so there are more than 100 of them in state legislatures across the country. These include so-called anti-trans sports bills, which are designed at keeping transgender girls of all ages from participating in organized academic sports, like playing soccer. These include, here in Maine, a bill that is designed to allow emergency shelters, whether they be domestic violence shelters or emergency housing shelters that are sex segregated, to deny services to transgender women and girls. They include in other states multiple bills which have become law that make providing gender-affirming medical care to minors illegal. Sometimes with some I think it's absurd that they pass these bills at all, but the punishments for these bills are well above and beyond your standard medical malpractice punishments. Some of them even include jail time. They include efforts to pass religious freedom bills across the country, and we're seeing fewer of these this year, but of course in the last couple of years we've seen a lot of so-called bathroom bills, which attempt to make it so that trans people cannot use a bathroom consistent with their gender identity and presentation. So I think it's worth asking, why are there so many of these and where did they come from? And it's tempting to talk about this being some kind of new attack on our community. And again, if we were to look at sort of the history of LGBTQ advocacy over the last 50 or 60 years, it's not always trans people who have been targets, but targeting LGBTQ people, particularly in the lead up to a midterm election, is a very, very common Republican strategy. And so I don't think that we are seeing any kind of new playbook here. I do think we're seeing an unprecedented level of attack from overwhelmingly Republicans against the trans community. But banning LGBTQ people from using public restrooms, making it difficult for us to participate in public life, limiting our ability to disclose information in public schools, this is all fairly standard practice by anti-LGBTQ people. It's just that the trans community is finally in the spotlight, and I think Republicans see an opportunity to win on these issues because they are quite divisive. And they chose in particular the sports issues because they are effective, because they're difficult to debate. And they're breaking up even some progressive coalitions. And so here in Maine, the sort of the three bills that we're focused on is we have LDs 926 and 1401. These are both sports bills, and then we have LD 1238, which is a shelter bill. And most of the press coverage over the last 6 months or so has been towards the sports bills, because I think that's fairly consistent with what we're seeing nationally. And I am certainly fearful of these bills and upset about them. I do think it's worth noting within sort of advocacy circles, we are particularly nervous about this shelter bill, even though I believe we just defeated it within the last couple hours, because we're the only state that has this bill. And so we're concerned that we might sort of be a trial run on this issue, and that we might see it popping up across the country in the next few years. So I think it is, not to bury the headline, none of these anti-trans bills are going to become law in Maine this year. We have already defeated or are close to defeating all three of them. But I do think it's worth noting the impact of these bills is not limited to them potentially becoming law. Even the debate over these bills has been deeply harmful on this community, and I am personally just devastated that another generation of young LGBTQ people have to know what it feels like to have their rights and their ability to participate in society debated by their elected officials and likely debated at their dinner tables and by their teachers. And that is harmful and demoralizing. And that doesn't have a hypothetical impact. Here in Maine, MaineTransNet, one of the things that we do is we track suicide within the trans community. And we have already doubled the number of suicides this year over our 2020 numbers. And that is a reversal following a 5-year decline in the suicide rate in our community, which we were incredibly proud of, which itself is concerning. Like, we've already doubled a 12-month period within the first 5 months of the year. But it's particularly concerning to us because the profile of who we're losing to suicide is changing. In the last 5 years, our data has shown pretty consistently that completed suicides are primarily among trans people over the age of 40, primarily among trans people who are isolated from their families. A lot of them are veterans. A lot of them are dealing with substance use challenges. Yet this year, we've buried 3 people under the age of 22 in the last 3 months. So we're seeing a significant shift towards younger suicides. And the only explanation that I have for this, because the only thing that's changed, is that these bills are being debated. And I think whether or not the people that we're losing would have blamed these bills specifically, I think that they did spend the last couple months of their life hearing that a lot of their elected officials don't have their back. Some of these suicides were in the districts of the sponsors of these bills. So it really isn't, from our perspective, a hypothetical problem. These bills are harmful whether or not they become law. I would also just add, as a small community organization, we have had the dual responsibility of helping lead the fight against these bills while also doing our best to keep a lot of youth alive over the last couple of months, and all of my youth program volunteers have been up late into the night, every single night. We have not had a day in the last 100 where we did not have a youth in crisis in our programs. So we are all pretty tired, and also that is just an unprecedented level of crisis in our community. So we really do believe that these bills are a major contributing factor to that. Some common threads throughout these bills and sort of how they're being framed by our opponents. First of all, a lot of these bills are targeted at youth. The sports bills, of course, are primarily affecting young people, but as we think about the bathroom bills nationwide, the trans care bills, a lot of them are really focused rhetorically or legally on impacts on youth. And we think, again, that is particularly harmful, but there's also a reason why they're targeting youth, because youth aren't prepared to fight back. They don't have the resources to do that, and so they make for a particularly easy target. Most of the bills we're seeing now, this is a shift from 5 years ago, is that they're specifically focused at transgender women and girls rather than the trans community as a whole, and that in doing so, they tend to play into a lot of harmful stereotypes about what do trans women and girls look like, what are our bodies like, that play into a lot of fearful assumptions that people have about what trans people's lives look like. And again, they're damaging beyond just the legal impact. So of course, one of the things that we found both in sort of the public debate around this, and then it was very evident in testimony and as well as during the work sessions, is a lot of focus on the stereotype of big, scary trans women. And the rhetoric sort of goes that trans women are biologically men. In fact, almost all of the Republicans who spoke on these bills refused to refer to trans women as women. They insisted on calling them biological males. And they're playing into the stereotype that trans women are always bigger, that they're more masculine, that they're at best sort of caricatures of womanhood who are really just men playing on it. They're arguing that inherent aspects of male anatomy, they really love that phrase, male anatomy, makes you a threat automatically. They're really focused on taking the assumptions behind that masculinity and that size and translating that into concerns for safety and fairness, particularly for girls being able to participate in sports. That's from elected officials who probably wouldn't go to the mat for Title IX. They're not longtime supporters of girls' sports. And that, they're also trying to frame this as a feminist issue. It's that they're protecting hard-won rights of women and girls from other women and girls who are different than them, who they view as being boys. So again, it is entirely based on stereotypes. We know from science, we know from just knowing trans people that trans women have normative body ranges. They have the same diversity in size and stature as cisgender women do. We know that anatomy does not make you inherently more dangerous or inherently advantageous within a sports context. But I think one of the things that makes these bills so effective rhetorically for our opponents is they play right into those assumptions that a lot of us have. Even if we want to be supportive of trans people, it plays into a lot of those assumptions, and it's hard to argue back against that if we don't have 5 minutes to explain why those assumptions are wrong. So some things that we would recommend if you're trying to debate these bills or fight back against them, that we'd advise you against doing. First and foremost, I would say avoid any discussion about trans people's bodies. It is very likely that you're going to be giving out inaccurate information that is not scientifically based. And I would also just say, I think the discussion around bodies tends to be the most vitriolic and the most harmful. And so I don't think there's anything to be won in that debate. We'd also advise against arguing about the science or biology or arguments of fairness. When our opponents are trying to get us into this part of the debate, they're not interested in citing peer-reviewed scientific studies. They're interested in citing their misunderstanding of 5th grade biology. And that's what they're trying to get you to believe. It's not well supported by science, and they're also, it's not a good faith argument. They're not listening. They're not going to be swayed by you handing them 5 journal articles to the contrary. So again, there's just nothing to be won there, and that framing of the issue is one where we consistently lose no matter what information we provide to people. We'd also discourage you from accepting the premise that the rights of trans women and the rights of cisgender women are incompatible. That's something that they insisted on frequently in the work session in particular, as well as in the public hearing, is that they might support the rights of trans women, but we also have to support the rights of cisgender women. And it's a false equivalency that these are in any way necessarily exclusive categories. The rights of all women are improved when we support the rights of any category within that. We discourage you from accepting the premise that trans women and girls are inherently predatory. There's a lot of talk about locker rooms. There's a lot of talk about what happens when we have a transgender male, a biological male in a woman's space like a shelter for domestic violence survivors. That is just unsupported by data. What our data tells us is that trans women and girls are not only not any more likely to be predators than cisgender women and girls, they're much more likely to be victims of predators. And they actually need the protection that these spaces offer. And then lastly, I have to say, we have to make sure that we're not giving into sensationalism around these bills. They've chosen these topics because it's a good wedge issue with the electorate, and the more airtime we give these bills, the more we lose on them generally. So, I think a good list of reasons why you might be opposed to the bills is fine, but a lengthy debate on Facebook isn't doing anyone any favors. Some points that we do encourage you making when talking about issues affecting trans women and girls. First and foremost, just reminding everyone that trans women are women and trans girls are girls. This is still something that is very much up for debate in our political sphere, but it's not up for debate in science, it's not up for debate in our community, and it's not up for debate in our discrimination laws. Trans women are women, we belong in sex-segregated spaces, and we need them just as much, if not more so, than cisgender women and girls. I think it's relevant to point out that laws targeting trans people tend to be illegal and expensive. We look at one of the early sports bills from, I think it was Idaho last year, that's currently held up in court. Trump appointed judges are ruling against these bills when they get put up in court. States are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting for them, and even the most conservative judges can't support them. So you're just going to cost the taxpayers more money. In some larger states that have, say, sports franchises, we're seeing there's like the NCAA backing out of having championship games in those states, which costs millions in potential tourism. So again, it's illegal and it's incredibly expensive. Again, just introducing these laws can do real damage. I think there's a tendency in our political discussion to pretend as though what we're debating in the legislature isn't affecting real lives. And again, that debate is hurting and costing the lives of transgender people. And we need to be aware of that when we talk about that. And then lastly, just, these bills hurt women and girls, both cis and trans. LD 926 which is one of the sports bills, had a provision in it for sex testing student athletes if their sex is under question from basically anyone else. There wasn't a mechanism for saying you've got to question that. And what they mean by sex testing is, under this bill, your daughter could have to have a genital exam at 12 to prove that she's a woman. And that's not remotely okay. And it's disgusting that anything like that was even proposed. Some points specifically that we focused on with LD 926. You'll find when if you read news stories about this, that there's the focus from our opponents tend to be on sports like swimming and track, where it's kind of one competitor against others, and that they're not really interested in talking about team sports. And most school sports are team sports. And the fairness argument that they make really doesn't hold up well when we're talking about team sports. I think it's also worth mentioning, we talk about track a lot, And that's not because there's some huge issue with fairness in track. It's that they can only find one high profile example of this ever being a problem. And that one example is used in every single debate in every state about this. So, some of the people who were testifying in favor of this bill, they're not from Maine, and they're not talking about issues that happened in Maine. It's primarily just one or two cases from other states. I think it's worth mentioning also that although competitiveness is important in sports, middle school soccer isn't about academic prowess. It's about important social and developmental opportunities. Are you making friends? Are you learning, determination and self-control and the ability to work towards a goal? And we don't have to treat middle school soccer and the Olympics the same way. And sort of these very high-level athletic bodies, they have already had policies in place for allowing trans people to participate for more than a decade. And so there's just not an issue here at the level at which the state has an interest in regulating. And again, here in Maine, trans girls playing sports is not something that's new. The Maine Principals Association has had a policy on the books since 2013 that's allowed trans people to play, and we know that there were trans people participating in school sports even before that. And again, there's not any evidence of there being any kind of substantive fairness or equity issue. So although I do think there's been a lot of focus on these anti-trans bills, there's also been some great things that have happened, both at the legislative level and nationally in the last 6 months. Of course, 926, 1401, and 1238 are all either dead or on their way to being dead, probably by the end of the night, we're hoping. So we are happy to say, although these bills did some harm in how they were debated, they're not going to become law here in Maine. However, not all of our energy in the legislature was focused on defeating bills. MaineTransNet is really proud to say that we proposed our first bill independent of our coalition this year, and LD 1044. And in a year where we are debating transgender sports, we managed to pass this bill which protects the rights of incarcerated transgender people to have access to gender affirming housing and search procedures and commissary. We passed that bill with bipartisan support out of committee and then under the hammer in both chambers. So we're looking forward to Governor Mills signing it, which we're anticipating any day now. And we're just really proud to be able to say that in a year where trans issues are so divisive and vitriolic, that we were able to pass what will be one of the strongest protections for incarcerated trans people in the country, and I would also add on the planet. So we're quite proud of that. There's several other bills that we're excited about. There's a bill that requires the CDC to issue a new birth certificate following a gender marker change rather than making an amended birth certificate, which is a really small technical thing that provides a lot of safety for trans people when we apply for jobs. We've made some huge wins in the Maine Parentage Act about how parental rights are determined in such a way that it prioritizes relationship to the child over biological relationship, which is important for same-sex parents. We passed a bill easing the process for name changes for minors. We passed a bill 1455, which is changes how sex work is prosecuted. Prostitution is prosecuted under Maine law in such a way that the DA has to prove that someone wasn't trafficked before they can get a guilty verdict, which we're expecting will substantially reduce the criminalization of sex work, which is an issue that disproportionately impacts the trans community. As of last week, there are now 3 openly trans elected officials here in Maine, all of them serving on school boards, all of them in rural, usually red districts. And then again, at the national level, we're looking at a couple of big victories. There's a recent guidance from the Biden administration on Title IX and making explicit the administration's views that it applies to sexual orientation and gender identity, which is undoing the Trump administration, undoing the Obama administration. It's a big win We're still probably going to have to duke that out in court, though. And then also the Biden administration recently released a new guidance on the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which clarifies the rights of trans prisoners as well and strengthens them. So we're excited about all of this. There's a lot of big wins, even though that's not necessarily what's making it into the press. So I think this sort of begs the question of what's next. What are we looking towards next? And I think our most immediate fight, which I think Kelly may have already shared a little bit with you all about this, is the Equality Act, which is a federal bill which, if it becomes law, will basically nationalize a similar set of non-discrimination protections to what we have here in Maine. And that's important because it addresses an issue that exists in a lot of states right now, where you can get married on Sunday and fired for it on Monday. It's probably the only way that a whole slew of states are going to have any kind of meaningful non-discrimination protections, and it's a vital step forward for federal law. 3 out of 4 of our congressional representatives here in Maine support the bill. Unsurprisingly, Senator Collins does not, and so we could use your help lobbying her to support the bill. She had supported previous drafts of it during previous sessions, so we're hopeful that we can change her mind. And I think, Kelly, if you wouldn't mind distributing our link about that, there we go. We have some complicated cases coming up in the Supreme Court. There was just a case that was announced this afternoon, Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, that concerns adoption rights, that I gotta admit, I'm still trying to parse exactly what the decision means, because it wasn't what we hoped for, but it also wasn't an unmitigated disaster. So I think we're, I'll try and send along an article in the next couple of days from people smarter than me about what exactly that decision means. But still, our future is in the hands of the Supreme Court, and we need to take back the court in order to ensure that future is a good one. Here in Maine, I know next session we're interested in looking at the rights of intersex people, particularly to be protected from sex assigning surgeries on infants, which is an issue, and we're also interested in addressing a right to gender affirming care, particularly for minors. And then just lastly, I think we're at an interesting phase as a movement where a lot of our sort of low-hanging fruit policies have been won, and yet, looking around and looking at our data, there is this huge gap between what our policies are here in Maine and what the reality of living as a trans person here in Maine is. We have some of the strongest non-discrimination protections in schools in the country, and yet we still have nearly 50% of transgender students being sexually assaulted by the time they graduate. We have high rates of bullying, we have high rates of discrimination, we have high rates of workplace discrimination that frequently goes unaddressed when reported. So there's a big gap between policy and reality, and I think we're trying to figure out how can we, from an advocacy perspective, work to close that gap over the next couple of sessions. And I look forward to sharing with you what solutions we come up with for that, but I think that's the question that we're facing going forward. And then lastly, how can you participate in this? What can you do? Again, contact Senator Collins about the Equality Act. Is a thing that if you could take care of that tonight, that would be awesome. It'll take you 30 seconds. I would add, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say this, financially supporting the work of trans-specific organizations is a great way to make sure that we continue to have the resources we need to fight back against terrible bills, while also supporting our community. And then I would just add, the toll that having your rights continually debated takes is significant. And a really easy thing that you can do is just make sure that the trans people in your life, or the loved ones of trans people in your life that know about the services that are available to them, whether it be through us at MaineTransNet or one of our partners. And then lastly, I would just add, it's been really disheartening, particularly with these sports bills. I have heard a lot of people who I would normally look up to and look to for guidance on policy, and particularly around feminism, who have been convinced to go the other way on these bills. And it is dividing coalitions, it is harming feminist advocacy here in Maine. And I would just say something like these sports bills might seem minor, but the way people think on these predicts how they vote on other issues that are key to the well-being of our community. And you can't tolerate it you can't let that disagreement just go. It has to be challenged, and there has to be consequences to it. So don't let your friends get away with casual transphobia. Lastly, if you're looking for more information about MaineTransNet and our work and our services, you can visit MaineTrans.net, or you can also contact us at info@MaineTransNet.org. And with that, I think I'm just about out of time, but we have a couple minutes for questions if anyone has any.
Hopefully more than just a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you very much. That was very informative, and very much appreciate your insights as to just how harmful this sort of thing being debated in our state house is to people feeling that life is worth it, or that they're okay to be who they are. And we certainly need to work on that, all of us. So we're open for questions. I want to remind everyone we're being recorded. You're welcome to send your questions in chat and I will pose them, or if you'd like to be recognized to ask your question and unmute yourself, please let us know. It's *6 if you're on the phone, or there is under reactions at the bottom of your Zoom window, a raise hand function there. So I'm sorry, *9 to raise a hand if you're on the phone, *6 to unmute yourself. Questions, anyone? Okay, so questions are coming in. Oh, got a response from Senator Collins already. It's not a question. Okay.
Well, that's good to know, because we weren't getting this response a couple days ago. So at least they've noticed that they're being lobbied.
Good. The response from Senator Collins says, I've been a leader on equal rights issues at the federal level throughout my service in the Senate. I was the lead Republican sponsor of the law that repealed the military's discriminatory don't ask, don't tell policy. I was also a longtime supporter of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which would prohibit discrimination in the workplace based on sexual orientation or gender identity. I led the effort to pass that bill through the Senate in 2013. I was a proud supporter of the Matthew Shepard Hate Crimes Prevention Act, a law that expands hate crimes protections to LGBTQ Americans. And I have co-sponsored bills to prevent discrimination in housing and jury service. The Equality Act, introduced by Senator Jeff Merkley, seeks to establish federal protections for LGBT individuals across a broad array of areas such as public accommodations, employment, and housing. Last Congress, I co-sponsored the Equality Act and as a starting point for negotiations. There are several provisions of this bill that I would like to see improved, and I hope that the bill's supporters will be willing to take the steps necessary to build bipartisan consensus to achieve the bill's goals. I continue to support passing a law to protect the civil rights of Americans, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Although we have certainly made progress on these issues, there is more work to do to secure these important protections. Again, thank you for protecting me. So do we know what she is withholding her support over? Is this another?
Yeah, sorry.
That is without merit, or?
Her objections have been fairly vague in typical Senator Collins form. I know when she was expressing her objection, she referenced the sports issue was one of her major concerns, which is confusing to us because the bill doesn't actually concern that. So we've been trying to get a meeting with her office to discuss that, and she has refused so far to meet with anyone about those concerns. So we're hoping putting some pressure on her might at least open her door to a meeting.
John Iltis is unmuted. John, did you have a question to ask Quinn?
No. Go ahead. No.
Okay. Questions, anyone? So I'm curious, Quinn. I don't see any other questions, but do you feel that
John Mills has a question?
Oh,
Sorry.
missed that. Where? John?
Unmute. Excuse me, gotta leave the room. Sorry, we're on in two different locations, so sorry about the feedback. Yeah, my question is the Legislative Exchange Council writes a lot of model legislature that gets sent out for various people to introduce. And so you see kind of the same general structure of a lot of legislation introduced in multiple points at once. And Quinn, you mentioned that there's a lot of similarity among the bills that are being proposed at the state level. And I'm wondering if you found that there is an organization like ALEC behind this that's writing model legislation and sending it out for consideration.
Yes, let me pull that up. So usually it's the Alliance Defending Freedom who's behind these bills. I think it is worth noting, we were anticipating a model bill on the sports bill before it was introduced, and neither of the two that they proposed reflected anything like what we saw in other states. So I don't get the impression in this specific case that they used model legislation, although I think they got the idea from the ADF or the Christian Civic League.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I mean, the reason for the question is to see if there is like a single point of contact where pressure could be exerted that might have an impact kind of on a broader basis. And it sounds like based on what you're seeing, there isn't right now.
Yeah, I do think emphasizing that these bills are coming from out of state, at least in terms of where they're getting the idea, was helpful for us. But yeah, in this one specific instance, it did not appear that they were using a model bill.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Just wanted to make a comment to tee off of what John was just saying. The sponsor of the shelter ban bill, Lisa Keim in the Senate, has signed a pledge from the Alliance for Defending Freedom. I dropped the link to the Southern Poverty Law Center's write-up on them. They are considered a hate group. She signed their pledge, which is a pledge that targets trans youth, LGBTQ youth in general, all of them. She signed it. Her name is on their website. She's proud about it. So even though the legislation that she submitted, the legislation that we saw on the sports bills may not have mirrored the language, I don't think there's any question at all that there are outside groups involved with this. And I think, and one of the reasons that I was sending these emails out to you guys today, and I've been talking about this for a while, we have a tendency to believe in Maine because the Democrats control the Senate, the House, and the Blaine House, the governor's seat, that we're safe here. And we are. These bills are going to die. And if they didn't die, Governor Mills is going to veto them. That's going to happen. We know that. And so we get a little, I think, comfortable in that. And we feel safe and secure. And we don't call our legislators and say, we want you to oppose this. Or in the case of LD 1044, the bill that Quinn talked about for incarcerated trans individuals, we don't call them and say, we want you to support it. They need to hear from us. I got an email this afternoon from Lydia Crafts, and her constituents flooded her inbox today. And she said she was already going to vote no, but she was so grateful to get it. She needs to hear that. They need to be able to say, my constituents don't want this, or my constituents do want this. So I think it's important that even if you know how your legislators are going to vote, it's so critical to be in touch with them and let them know.
Yeah, and I would add, even the Democrats are important to contact. With our incarceration bill, it was the Democratic Senate chair of the committee that gave us the most trouble, not the Republicans. And it's usually for unusual reasons, not necessarily being anti-LGBTQ, but they do need to know that people are paying attention.
So do raise your hand or get my attention in chat if there's something that you'd like to pose as a question. Quinn, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that there is quite a gap between the law and the reality. And I'm wondering if there are programs being worked on to inform educators, inform school board members, to start changing the reality for our youth.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but MaineTransNet, as well as some of our partners, we do work with local school districts. And we've worked with several school districts in the last year to pass what are called transgender student policies, which sort of dictate within the confines of existing Maine law, sort of the procedure for how a trans student is going to be accepted into school. We regularly train faculty at all the schools. I've done a couple of trainings at Lincoln Academy in the last 2 years, which was mostly well received. Done a couple with Wiscasset Middle and High School as well. They have some really wonderful faculty members there supporting their students. So, and that makes a real difference for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think there's a lot of professionals in education, healthcare, and social services who mean well, but are really afraid of doing the wrong thing. And that fear is paralyzing sometimes. And that can't be, because when something's going wrong and a transgender person needs someone to stand up for them, we need to know that person's going to be there. So they have to be prepared to do that. And so I think training, from our perspective, there's some specific skills that we focus on, but we also talk a lot about sort of getting over their stuff with this issue to a point where they can engage comfortably, even if not perfectly. It's important. And then also, I think there's a lot of it's a lack of knowledge about what Maine law actually dictates, particularly around education policy, because it is actually fairly granular here in Maine. Some of the rights that trans students have, and they're not immediately obvious in terms of like record keeping and chosen names and protecting information from parents. And I think there are a lot of school districts that violate those laws without consequence, and that harms trans kids. And I think as soon as the administration and the teachers know better, they do better. So.
I have a question that came in about displaying pronouns. Is it just good to do it as a cisgender person in all situations? Why would that be important to the LGBT community?
Yeah, so I encourage folks to do it. I think it's been interesting over the course of the pandemic to see as some people choose to incorporate it into our Zoom names and not. I think that's a great place to do it. I think email signatures are a great place to do it. I encourage doing it because it normalizes the practice, which makes it a lot easier for a trans person when we're trying to inform someone otherwise than what they may have assumed our pronouns were. It also means, displaying them isn't necessarily a sign that someone is trans, and that's helpful for safety and keeping people from being outed. So it's a great thing to do. It takes all of 30 seconds in most cases to set that up on an email or a Zoom account. And so it's a small little act of allyship that you can do.
In fact, in my former job, it was one of the things that I asked people in preparing their email signatures. Would you like pronouns on yours? And if so, which? So a very, very quick thing to do.
The one thing I will say, if you do it, don't get fancy with it. You look silly. Just real simple. I think, I have mine in on my Zoom here. That's a pretty standard format, or in parentheses, it's fine too.
Yep.
You don't have to write a paragraph explaining it. Just stick it below your name.
Right. There's another question. Someone saying, you mentioned the uptick in suicide rates. How did COVID affect this?
Yeah, we were really lucky as an organization with COVID for a couple of reasons. First of all, we were just really lucky in terms of our funding cycle that we had some financial flexibility to shift around our staffing at the beginning of the pandemic, but also that we were already planning an expansion to online programming last year that was going to launch in April of 2020. So we built everything already. It was just a scaling issue. And, 2020 was the lowest rate since we started measuring 7 years ago for transgender suicide in Maine. And I think a big part of that is online programs made community and belonging accessible to people in rural communities in a way that our in-person programming has never succeeded at doing. I would hear from people from the county and people, in far western Maine who would talk about how frustrating it is to maybe get to go to a support group once a month, assuming it doesn't snow and that the facilitator isn't sick. And they go from that to they could attend a group 7 days a week, and they could go on our Discord server 24/7. And so we've saw a huge uptick in the amount of people in crisis we've been supporting over the last year. And MaineTransNet, we don't serve all trans people in Maine, but the data we have suggests we serve the trans people who really, really need us. So we have sort of a bias towards people in crisis in our programs. So we've been serving them a lot more, and yet we've had fewer suicides. And I think that just means that COVID allowed us to build the infrastructure to catch more people. And that's a good thing. I'd also say, there are a lot of people who came out in the last year and transitioned in the last year, because that first 6 to 12 months is really hard for a lot of folks, and working from home made that easier. And I think there are some lessons in that about our workplaces and the level of safety that they offer. Is when people didn't have to be with their colleagues all day, every day, they felt safer to be themselves.
All right, and well, in a small way related to that, I suppose, if there's a workplace impact that's not what it ought to be, on people feeling comfortable being themselves, could you talk more about being good allies? Are there training that's available for that MaineTransNet offers programs? How can we learn more?
So I would say we and some of our partner organizations offer a wide variety of trainings. We have a couple that are specifically for workplaces and employers. We work with whole staff at businesses, or frequently just management, either providing training or provide consultation on workplace policies. That's a service that we offer. So if you're interested in bringing that to a workplace, we have a full menu of our trainings available on our website. Perhaps, Kelly, if you'd be willing to stick that in the chat. I would say most of the places we train, workplaces that we train, they bring us in usually because they've just hired someone, or someone's just come out in the workplace, and that can be a little awkward, I imagine, to be the trans person who caused your company to make that shift, but usually it's a net positive. Our trainings usually run a couple hours. They're pretty fun. We're paid to be nice to you, so.
Well, that's great. Are there more questions from anyone? See any hands raised? Okay. And I guess we should wrap this up by saying thank you very much, Quinn. And it's been wonderful getting some understanding and insight to how we can do better and what some of the real challenges are in Maine that you've been working to remedy. And times the kinds of comments you hear in the legislature, I'm sure, extremely difficult. Thank you for what you do and for joining us tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
If people want to unmute and applaud.
Yes, please.